Good evening, everyone. My name is Zita Nunes. I'm on the faculty of the English department. And it's an honor for me to introduce to you Mecca Jamilah Sullivan in a welcome home of sorts. Mecca earned her PhD here at Penn. And although it's a daunting task to describe the career of someone so accomplished and still have time left over for her to read from her work, I'm going to give the introduction as best I can, and then we'll hear from Mecca. So Mecca is the author of the novel Big Girl, a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, and a Best Books pick from Time, Essence, Vulture, Ms., Goodreads, Library Reads, and SheReads.com. And that's not even the entire list. I'm going to say that at every point. That's not even the entire list. Her previous books are The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora from University of Illinois Press, the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, and which is the winner of the Judith Markowitz Award for Fiction from the Lambda Literary. Mecca, as I said, is returning home. She holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in English and creative writing from Temple University, and a BA in Afro-American Studies from Smith College. Her short stories have appeared in Best New Writing, Kenyon Review, Prairie Schooner, Callaloo, Bloom, Queer Fiction, Art, Poetry, and more, Tri-Quarterly, Feminist Studies, and many, many others. A Pushcart Prize nominee, Mecca is the winner of the Charles Johnson Fiction Award, the Glenna Lushing Fiction Award, the James Baldwin Memorial Playwriting Award, the 2021 Pride Index National Arts and Culture Award, and honors from the National Endowment for the Arts, Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Yaddo Colony, the Hedge Book Writers Retreat, Lambda Literary, and the Publishing Triangle, the Center for Fiction in New York City, where she received an inaugural Emerging Writers Fellowship. And I trimmed down that list too, if you can believe it. So, a proud native of Harlem, New York, Mecca's scholarly work explores the connections between sexuality, identity, and creative practices in contemporary African diaspora literatures and cultures. Her scholarly and critical writing has appeared in New York magazine's The Cut, American Literary History, Feminist Studies, American Quality, Palimpsest, Journal of Women, Gender, and the Black International, GLQ, Lesbian and Gay Studies Quarterly, and other scholarly publications. I cut that list down, as well as on BET.com, Ebony.com, The Root, Ms. Magazine, The Feminist Wire, and many others. Her research and scholarship have earned support from Mellon Mays, the Social Science Research Council, numerous universities, the American Academy of University Women, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, which was formerly the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. I have another page here. Oh, here it is. Her debut novel, Big Girl, from Norton, which is on sale here. You can purchase a copy that Mecca will autograph for you, yes, at a reception to follow the reading. Was selected as the July 2022 Phenomenal Book Club pick, a WNYC Radio 2022 debut pick, and the New York Public Library's Book of the Day. Of the novel, author Kisa Lyman says, "There are 3 books on earth that I would give anything to have been able to write and reread until the sun burns us up. Big Girl is one of those books." Please join me in welcoming Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, who will read from her novel and then take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for editing the bio. If you know my prose, you know that I enjoy lists. I enjoy commas. That's clearly reflected in the bio. Every time I try to sort of switch it up a little bit, it always reverts back to that same sort of rhythm. And hopefully we'll get to talk about rhythm and what's going on with rhythm in my prose. But I just want to say it's so wonderful. As soon as I walked into this space, in fact, even just walking across Leah Kurra's walk, you know, this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I did a master's degree at Temple in creative writing, and from there came straight to Penn, where I did my PhD in English Lit, studying with the great Herman Beavers, who is in the building. And this space it really meant a lot to me as a kind of developing literary scholar who was really working to hold fast to my identity as a creative writer and to be in a space that was about writing and for creative writing. So I just want to give a shout out to the Writers House. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having had me, you know, since way, way, way back in the day. And thank you so much to everyone who has come out. I mean, it's really, again, just so wonderful to see folks here from various points and times in life, and of course, new folks who I can't wait to meet. So I'm going to read from Big Girl. I had a kind of plan of what I was going to read, and I think I'm going to switch it up a little bit, but I want to begin with a section that takes place in Philadelphia. So I think of Big Girl as a novel about women, about queer people, about Black women in particular, people of color more broadly, and the paths we take, often across generations, to make space for ourselves in the world. The novel follows a character named Malaya Clondon from the time she's a big Black 8-year-old girl to the time she's a very big Black queer young woman, a teenager. And it follows her trajectory into adulthood, but also a kind of path to discover the meanings of her body, both as it's understood by the people around her, what the social meanings of her body might be, and ultimately to kind of figuring out a way to define that body for herself. And so it also thinks about themes of race, of gender, of class, of embodiment, ability and disability, mobility, body shape and size, etc. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of Harlem, New York, sort of at the height of the crack epidemic in the late 1980s into the sort of first major wave of late 20th century gentrification in the 1990s. So all of that is going on when we meet Malaya. And the section I'm going to read is from an early part of the novel, so it doesn't need a ton of setup. But what you need to know is that her parents, her mother is a college professor, a psychology professor, getting ready to come up for tenure. And her father is a computer programmer. And they've just bought this house in Harlem. And, you know, again, it's the late 1980s. And so this purchase represents a kind of class mobility for the family, even as it represents a kind of loss for Malaya. And this is something that she's thinking about a lot. In this section, she's being sort of whisked away to Philadelphia to spend time with her grandmother for the summer. And the other part that is important here is recently doctors have started using the language morbidly obese to describe her body. And so one of the things she's trying to figure out is what that language means, again, to the people around her and what it should mean, if anything, to her. Her grandmother has ideas about this, which we'll come to see. As the year pressed on towards spring, the air in the Clondon home grew heavier and more tense, though Malaya was not sure why. No one spoke on this change. Yet as the evenings warmed, Percy came home later and later, and instead of coming up to the kitchen to kiss Malaya on the forehead and talk with Naila about their days as he had once done, now he called hello from the vestibule and trudged up to the second floor to soak for hours in the tub. Naila responded by coming home later as well, though still usually several hours before Percy. Naila and Malaya sat and ate dinner together, covering a plate of whatever Giselle, the babysitter, had prepared and leaving it for Percy on the stove, though it often went untouched until Giselle threw it away the next day. For Malaya, the only real escape from home was summer. The anticipation of summer was one of the few things she felt she had in common with her classmates at Galton, which is the private Upper East Side school she attends, though she suspected their reasons were different from hers. At the first stirrings of spring, an air of excitement spilled into the classrooms, brightening even the dullest lessons, like colonial history and spatial visualization. By mid-May, Galton children began chirping about their summer plans, trips to country houses and faraway places with glamorous names like the Berkshires or Rehoboth Beach. Sometimes they talked about the summer camps they attended each year, places where they lived different lives entirely, and where anything was possible, where the nerd girl Randall Crichton could be the cool New York City girl instead of a jittery math dweeb, and where even snot-nosed Ben Heath could have a girlfriend. What Malaya looked forward to was the season's foods. Plump burgers dripping with gooey cheese and ketchupy grease, fresh off the grill at the family reunion, impossibly cold ices from the Coco Helado cart that stuck to her fingers and stained her mouth deep shades of red and blue, an ever-presence of ice cream. Getting her hands on these summer foods wasn't easy under Naila's vigilant eye. Naila was home more often in the summer, especially in the early days before the summer session on campus began. And so for Malaya, the thrills of summer were elusive. The thrills of summer eating were elusive. But that was the beauty of the season. It was long, an endless stretch of possibility, and Malaya was sure to sample its sticky delights at least once or twice. Most of all, Malaya looked forward to the brief nothing of summer. Days without classes or report cards or terrible games of freeze tag, evenings unmarked by her father's absence from the dinner table, afternoons with nothing to fill them but space and the buzzing sun. She usually had a week or two of this kind of summer before Naila took her for her annual 2-week visit with Ma Mère. But this year, there were only 3 such days, right after school ended. Then Malaya was made to pack her hot pink Shiraz suitcase. Naila knotted a fresh set of beads into her braids, and the two boarded the train for Philadelphia, where she would spend most of the summer vacation alone with Ma Mère. On the train, Malaya sat with her pencils and sketchbook while Naila flipped through a fashion catalog, remarking on the dresses she liked. "This one's pretty, don't you think?" she said, turning the catalog toward Malaya to reveal an uninteresting sleeveless dress the color of papier-mâché. Malaya looked vaguely at the image and nodded. "We can buy it as a gold dress," Naila said, folding the corner of the page. "Maybe it'll fit by the end of the summer. I can bring it when I come back to pick you up. Ma Mère will love it on you." Malaya resented the idea of a gold dress. 2 springs ago, Naila had said the same thing about a dress she'd bought herself. She came home one day with 3 summer dresses, 2 pale lace ones with eyelets at the neck, and a wonderfully bright sundress that looked to Malaya like the inside of an orange. I'm getting into these by the end of the summer," Naila declared as she hung the dresses on the towel hook beside the bathroom mirror. "Maybe I'll wear the orange one when I come to pick you up." But Naila wore blue jeans and a loose gray cardigan when she showed up in Philadelphia that August, and the dresses were still there waiting with the tags on when they returned home. They appeared again the following summer, and Malaya noticed them as she had packed this year, too, hanging in a stalwart row along the shower curtain rod. The idea of buying a too small dress and trying to impress Ma Mère angered her, but she could not help but admire the way Naila licked her index finger and mused at the catalog, her wrists arched elegantly before flipping back each glossy page, her bracelets tinkling in the air. As the train rolled past the plush lawns and sprawling malls of New Jersey, Malaya thought about the Philly summer that lay before her. Days spent slogging through the city to Ma Mère's hair appointments and auxiliary meetings, returning home to eat bland, colorless meals and watch the news while Ma Mère talked about Malaya's weight and criticized Naila's failures in her absence. Malaya imagined leaping off the train and springing out onto the wide roads beyond the glass, rolling alongside the tracks in an endless cartwheel until she reached the nearest mall, where she would stow away all summer and eat candy. "Malaya, you're going to listen to Ma Mère, right?" Naila said, as though in response to a complaint Malaya hadn't made. She rested the magazine on her lap and looked at Malaya. "I know it can be difficult, but she loves you." At the station, Naila arranged for a ride from one of the neighborhood hack taxi drivers, men who gave rides around the neighborhood, making small talk and playing old R&B songs on their car radios. When they arrived at Ma Mère's, she was waiting for them at the door. "Well, there's my Lai," she said. Malaya followed behind Naila, sucking in her stomach to make room for herself and her suitcase, as she gave Ma Mère an air kiss in the doorway. Ma Mère lived alone in the 2-story townhouse where Naila had grown up, yet Malaya had a hard time imagining a child had ever lived there. The walls were covered with grainy wood paneling that reminded her of a church, and all the furniture was fitted with a clear plastic covering that had gone brownish yellow with time, so that the long fancy chair Ma Mère called the Chase Lounge looked the color of a tea spill, even though Mamer insisted proudly that it was ivory white. Malaya didn't know what a chase lounge was. To her, chasing and lounging could not have been more different, and lounging was clearly the better of the two. But whatever a chase lounge was, it was obviously very special, because when Malaya stretched out on it with her headphones on, bouncing lightly to Stephanie Mills on her Walkman, while Naila and Mamer talked about the train ride, Mamer darted her eyes at her and said, "Don't sit like that on the chase lounge, my Lili, and stop that bouncing. Can't have you breaking up my good furniture. This ain't the demolition derby." Naila gave Malaya a sympathetic smile but said nothing. After that, Malaya sat as stiffly as possible with both feet on the carpet, but still she felt Mamer's eyes on her. Eventually she gave up, collected her markers and pencils, and slid down the chase lounge to sit on the floor. It was a Friday evening, and Naila and Mamer were perched on Mamer's grand brocade-covered chairs watching the stories. Malaya found these soap operas horrifically boring, an emblem of the slow pace and numbing predictability of Philly summers. After a few years of hearing Malaya complain of boredom, Naila had convinced Mamer to devise child-friendly activities for Malaya's summer visits. Mamer began to prepare a board bag, in which she collected cartoons, puzzles, and word games she'd clipped from newspapers and fashion magazines all year in advance of Malaya's visit. The board bag hung on a plastic candelabra next to the kitchen doorway, which Malaya saw as a useless ploy to keep her from eating, as though, distracted by the wonders of the daily cryptoquote, she would forget about food. She resented this underestimation of her, but she never said anything because, in spite of herself, she liked the cryptoquote. She enjoyed sitting at the kitchen table, hunting through the newspaper for word clues while Mamer fixed breakfast and read her magazines. Sometimes they worked on the cryptoquote together, and Mamer told stories about the books each message came from and the people who had written them. Mamer had an impressive store of knowledge, particularly on topics related to Black history. She loved words, loved philosophical musings, and Malaya admired this. There was no denying the thrill of arranging the letters on the mealy strip of newsprint Mamer had stitched for her, watching the sentence emerge like a Polaroid until the message came together. Independence is happiness, or learning never exhausts the mind. Malaya was not sure that she knew what the messages meant, but sleuthing them out and collaging them into mouthfuls was one of summer's true pleasures. She looked forward to it every morning, though she would never have said this to Mamer. The morning after they arrived, Naila gave Malaya an air kiss and said, "You'll be back home before you know it. It'll be okay." Then she vanished to the train. When she was gone, Malaya and Mamer settled into their usual vacation routine. Every morning they got up at 6 a.m. and Mamer fixed breakfast of plain instant oatmeal or Rice Krispies with skim milk and a single packet of Sweet and Low. Then they did their morning exercises, an age of leg lifts and jumping jacks on towels stretched out on the living room floor. Sometimes Mamer played an exercise video on the VCR, and Malaya stared at the host, a peppy, curly-haired white man with a voice like a New Year's kazoo. She watched as he bounced around the screen pinball style to the beat of old dance songs, calling out phrases like, "We're twisting the fat away," and "Let's scream, let's shout, shake those calories to the ground," while Malaya panted, trying to keep up. If Mamer struggled with the exercises, she never let it show. When she started to breathe or sweat too hard, she simply stopped the video. "We have to be ladies," she would say, lifting a piece of sugar-free chewing gum to her mouth and biting down primly, "even if we're big as men." Then she would make her second cup of coffee and go back to reading the fashion magazines before preparing for the day's appointments. Malaya thought of this as ladiness. Ladiness was a way of speaking and sitting and moving, of exercising somehow without sweating, which Malaya worried she would never understand. It was an elaborate lattice work of do's and don'ts that were never fully spoken, but that carried grave consequences when transgressed. The only thing that was really sure about the rules, from what Malaya could tell, was that they were impossible to follow. Each time she thought of ladiness, she imagined this: Mamer and Naila and her, all in a line, holding their breath, trying to be as still and small as possible. They could never quite do it, even in her imagination. Despite all the exercising and calorie counting and stiff sitting and not eating, Naila was rounder than Mamer, and Malaya, at age 8, was the biggest of them all. But there they were, 3 not ladies holding hands, each one trying harder than the last, and as bad as it was to fail at ladiness, to stop trying was unthinkable. This summer, Malaya thought of the fourth grader, Dondre Harris, and the humiliating games of freeze tag she had played on the courtyard, and she vowed at least to try. When she did a good job, Ma Mère poured praise over her like rain. Whenever she left food on her plate after dinner or didn't finish all of the tuna salad and saltines Ma Mère set out for lunch, Malaya looked down at her as though her face Ma Mère looked down at her as though her face was a sunrise and said, "I'm proud of you, Malala." Malaya felt her skin glow all over, which propelled her to try even harder. She worked her way through the breathless exercise tapes, the mealy breakfast, the slow Philadelphia days. Eventually, a few weeks into summer, Ma Mère pitched her thighs, wiggled her flesh, and said, "Ham hock's getting loose, my Lili. That means the meat's getting ready to slide off. Soon you'll be lean as a light pole and pretty as Beverly Johnson." Malaya had no idea who Beverly Johnson was, but she felt her future blooming in Ma Mère's face. These victories early in summer heartened her, and she declared it privately in her mind. This year, ladiness would stick. She would remember the meeting lady's guiding principle, nothing tastes as good as being thin feels. She imagined her new self emerging, narrow and sandy-skinned on the first day of class in September. She saw herself popping into the classroom with a bright smile, her hair in a frothy updo like Lisa Turtle from Saved by the Bell, chirping a carefree, "Hey guys," before sliding into the lunchroom table next to Amandra Wilson and her cool, skinny friends. Nothing tastes as good as being thin feels. Through each bland breakfast, each grim lunch, each juiceless dinner, through Ma Mère's appointments, the evening game shows, and the nightly news, she reminded herself to prioritize the program, to tap into her well of willpower, and give herself over only to food-free fun. For the first full week, she didn't sneak into the kitchen even once at night. Instead, she looked for food-free fun in the cryptoquote and in Ma Mère's stories, which were like cryptoquotes come to life. Some of Ma Mère's sayings made sense to Malaya and others didn't, but all of them made her mind dance with possibility. When Malaya told Ma Mère that Percy had been working late recently, Ma Mère said that he was giving her a warning, like a cow sitting down before the rain. And when they missed the Only Avenue bus one day because Malaya couldn't find a pair of shorts that fit, Ma Mère pulled her to the bus stop payphone and said, "If I wanted to sit my own life out for a child that couldn't dress, I would have stayed with your grandfather." Then she plopped in a quarter to call a taxi. Ma Mère sprinkled sayings like these into long, detailed stories as they bussed around the city. She was a busy woman. She had taken up college classes in African American studies after her retirement from the Philadelphia City Clerk's office and spent her spare time on an array of impressive activities, going on cruises with her retired ladies travel group, working part-time as a tour guide at the new African American History Museum downtown, serving on North Philadelphia's Community Garden Council, and volunteering at the local community center where she read books to the blind. As they moved through the warm hum of the city's summer air, Ma Mère talked about the trips she had taken with her senior Sunbirds group to exotic places like St. Lucia and Las Vegas, where, she said, quote, "they got enough lights to put the sun out of business." She talked about the women in her Silver Sparrows bowling league, about their hair and their husbands, who, Ma Mère said, were, quote, "round as bowling balls and dumber than the pins." She talked about the classes she was taking at the local community college, courses in American Sign Language and Braille, because, as she put it, quote, "the sighted don't half hardly see, and the hearing don't listen anyway. Better off talking with folks that have real sense." Malaya liked learning about Ma Mère's life. It struck her as big and surprising. Naila often said that Ma Mère had become a different person after getting divorced, around the time that Naila graduated college. She said this with a doleful sigh, as though this new flair for the unpredictable was a symptom of great loss. But listening to Ma Mère's stories now, Malaya decided privately that if this was what being alone could turn a woman into, it might not be that bad after all. So I think I'm going to, thank you, I like the snaps, appreciate that. I'm going to skip forward and read a section from a little bit later in the novel. So the novel sort of skips forward to 1996. Malaya is 15 years old. And so the school that she attends on the Upper East Side sort of is a wealthy, predominantly wealthy white school that is attended by predominantly wealthy white kids of, Malaya is sort of in the minority in several ways in that school. And around the 8th grade, the sort of demographic makeup of the school changes, right? And so there's an influx of public school kids sort of come and join the fold, right? And sort of become part of the community in this school. And at the same time, hip hop is sort of becoming a major part of Malaya's life, partly because she's a teenager, right? And so it's about sort of seeking out a music of her own, but also because hip hop is becoming more commercial. We're moving from, the kind of bass heavy rap music of the late 1980s into hip hop, which has hooks, which has, different kinds of melodies, and it's becoming sort of more commercially successful, right? And so there's a kind of element of a kind of class ascendancy and class mobility happening there. At the same time, this is when we're starting to see the first, again, wave of gentrification of Harlem in the 1990s. And so that's all to kind of set the scene for what's happening here. The scents of black coconut and African pear oils wafted toward Malaya from the tables that lined the street. As she walked, the smells of fried and jerked chicken, roti and rice pudding, platanos and candy yams seeped from the storefront restaurants, mixing together like the ingredients of a gumbo. They spilled over Malaya as she moved down the block after endless block, veering inward toward the stores to make room for a hurried, dreadlocked man in a hoodie, then outward to avoid colliding with a cluster of children giggling in bubble jackets and scarves. She fingered the 3 purple braids that hung from her left temple and made games for herself as she walked, trying not to imagine what 125th Street thought of her, this double-wide block of black girl, streaked with color, bounding toward the big and tall men's section of Harlem jeans. The melody of TLC's newest ballad drifted across 8th Avenue. In the alcove between the Apollo Theater and Tsitsi's African hair braiding, a cassette bootlegger pumped Shabba Ranks' deepest bass line into the street. Malaya could hear these songs, blending with laughter, catcalls, arguments over the prices of African masks and homemade soaps. A black Israelite man on the corner of Frederick Douglass, shaking a leather-wrapped arm at children and passersby, and car horns and sirens rang somewhere around 123rd. Children snickered as Malaya pushed her way through the crowd, and an older man shouted, "Whoa," when she passed, splaying his arms and making an exaggerated leap backward out of her way. By 1996, Harlem was louder, its air sharper and more defiant. The changes came first in a trickle, then in a rush. The previous winter, a few idle chain businesses cropped up on St. Nicholas in Amsterdam, a lone Today's Man clothier and a Living Well lady gym, perched close to the subway lines. Before, the street vendors had gathered on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and line 125th from Broadway to Lexington, selling African print clothing, homemade soaps, bootleg tapes, and thick sugary bean pies so good everyone bought them 2 at a time. But by the middle of this year, they were gone. A city rezoning project swept them up under a dusty tent on 116th with a dingy green and white plastic marquee labeled Betty Shabazz Shopping Plaza. This was widely regarded as an offensive display of city officials' ignorance. Everyone knew the First Lady of Black Liberation would never have suffered such inelegance in her name. The changes were massive, but the soul of Harlem seemed determined to fight. The restaurants and clothing stores that had been decades-long staples now pasted Xerox signs on their windows reading "Support Black Businesses." They held regular events featuring African, Latin American, Caribbean food, music, and fashion, a full geography of Black cultures blaring out onto the streets. At times it seemed the whole neighborhood was lit in bold tones of red, black, and green. For Malaya, Harlem's indomitable largesse was made all the more delicious by its new soundtrack. The staccato rap beats she once heard pumping from boom boxes outside the brownstone window now seemed to shake hands with soul drags, funk riffs, and R&B synth sounds that her father, Percy, loved to play on Saturday mornings. Together they made a dazzling new confection, hip-hop, that seemed to charge the air with life. In her girlhood, she had had to lean against the window to catch snippets of other generations' music from car windows outside and beg her mother to buy bootleg cassettes to play on her Walkman. But now at 15, she could push through the blocks on her own, her ears warmed by the foam pads of her CD player, listening to a music that seemed to have been made with her in mind. Her favorite song was one she had discovered 2 years ago in the 8th grade and claimed as her own personal anthem, an introduction to her newfound idol and kindred soul. "It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine." The track was an irresistible tale of rags to riches, chronicling the rapper's rise from blinding despair into unfathomable technicolor hope. The artist was a big black man from Brooklyn with a lazy eye and a face as soft as chocolate frosting. His body puffed like a pouch of Jiffy Pop from beneath his chin, and his voice was always thick and smooth, as though there was a scoop of ice cream perpetually lodged in his throat. Malaya loved the way the man told his success story, how he so prized the vestiges of hard living while casting the present as a gorgeous and unending feast. His album was full of all the things Malaya's mother hated and many of the things her father prized, sex and death and hope and fantasy, all mixed together like a compote, baked into a hard but secretly sweet crust. Malaya loved the paradox of the rapper's moniker, Biggie Smalls, how it was intimidating and diminutive at once, how it said, so succinctly, so many of the things she'd been feeling all these 15 years of her life. When Naila saw the CD, Ready to Die, lying among Malaya's Sharpie markers and gel pens, she arched her eyebrows and asked, so this is the message our artists are sending the youth now? Percy only looked and shook his head. He said the album reflected a new generation struggle and that it was their job as parents not to understand. There was something insistently unexpected in hip-hop, and it entitled Malaya to become unexpected too. It meant she could be angry and tender, sad and hopeful, a black girl besotted, full of feeling, wearing lipstick and big men's clothes. She turned up the volume on her Discman and let the beat cover her as she pushed toward the big and tall. How you live in Biggie Smalls and Mansion and Benz is giving ends to my friends and it feels stupendous. I have to say, I always want to keep rhyming, but I'm not going to do it. Big woman, the cherry-colored man at the bag check counter exclaimed as she cleared the threshold. He rounded his arms into a sumo wrestler pose. The acrid stink of new plastic bags smacked forth as Malaya pushed her way into the store. The man had become an uncomfortable acquaintance by now. He always looked friendly enough, but he had wet old eyes that seemed to catch on her body and draw away only full seconds after he spoke. He was short and squat, with a thin scar that curved along the side of his cheek. I remember you. Do you have a husband? Yes, Malaya said plainly, taking the bag check ticket. I told you before. The man acted as though she hadn't spoken. So big, he continued, healthy, but you have a pretty face. I'll call you Big Girl, Pretty Face, he concluded, but his eyes raked her stomach. Each time someone told her, you have such a pretty face, she felt as though they wanted to sever her head from her body, to discard the meat of her and leave the small, round disc of her face as her one saving quality. She was supposed to be grateful for the attention, and in spite of herself, she was. This was what angered her the most. These conversations made her uncomfortable, even sad, but she needed them in a way she couldn't find words for. She imagined her foot uprooted from its plot on the ground, striking the man's cheek way above the counter with a cartoon-style pow. Instead, she smiled politely and said thank you, and put the ticket in her pocket. You give me your phone number when you leave, okay? The man's voice trailed behind her like a curl of stale smoke. There were no mannequins in the big and tall men's section at the back of the store. Only reams of logo-stamped cloth folded 2 or 3 times back, elbows pinioned together, hems rolled 3 times under to gesture at normal man-sized forms. Malaya pushed past the Paco and Boss and Pele Pele racks toward the MC labels, which she'd chosen as her favorite a year ago, when she made the twin discoveries that the brand both spelled out her initials with its logo and carried clothes in her size. When she heard the way Biggie used it in a chart-topping single, she considered it destiny. Throw down some ice for the nicest MC. Niggas know the stilo. Unbelievable. She scanned the racks for a purple MC sweater and a pair of size 50 jeans, imagining herself sitting casually in a room that glinted with color and light like a Hype Williams video, swaddled in richly dyed denim. She thought giddily about how the cuffs of the jeans would fold into the tongues of her Timberland boots like waves of soft-serve ice cream into waffle cones, how tight and slick the look would make her feel. As she hovered by the banks of oversized denim at the back of the store, a slim saleswoman with skin the color of Ritz crackers approached. Her eyes were warm at first, but when Malaya asked for what she wanted, the woman looked at her as though she had requested a side of creme fraiche with her McDonald's extra value meal. They don't make big men shirts in purple, she said, running a green acrylic tip nail over her hairline, and the biggest jeans we got is a 48. The woman handed her the 48s and suggested she try on a dingy velour sweater that reminded her of tile grout instead. Malaya hadn't been weighed in years, but she knew she was at least 300 pounds because the last time she went to one of the many specialists Naila had found for her in the 7th grade, the scale stopped at 300 when she stepped on it and would go no further. She had willed herself to not to feel defeated, bathing herself in the music she loved, braiding colors into her hair, and matching them to her fashion to satisfy her own desire and whim. She had gone up in big men's sizes from a 42 to a 46 to a 48. Now fear rooted heavy in her chest as she wondered if she'd finally outgrown even the big men's sizes. Malaya accepted the clothes, and the salesgirl gave a shallow sigh behind her as she walked toward the fitting room. She squeezed herself through the fitting room doors. The walls there were covered with graffiti tags, lewd drawings, beeper numbers, and fragmented rhymes. She slid off her headphones and examined the walls, reading limericks about girls named China, looking at cartoon sketches of men with bulbous stomachs and sagging chests, learning which women the customers of Harlem jeans thought were good for which kinds of sex. She unlatched the button on her jeans and felt her stomach sigh into place. There was a strip of flesh around her middle that had been rigged raw over the years by the constant rub of too tight denim, and now she felt the skinless strip sting. She rubbed her fingers on her jeans and touched the raw patch, dabbing it dry with the back of her hand, wincing at the sting of contact. She pulled the 48s up, past her thighs and her hips, past her pillowy middle, the skin seething. She sucked in and tried to push the ends of the denim together, but they would not meet. She gulped breath, sucked in, tugged again, seethed again, over and over, until water clung to her eyelashes and her face got hot. The biggest jeans we got is a 48. She fished a Sharpie from the pocket of her jacket and uncapped it, the sour smell boring into her nostrils. She angled herself against the wall and drew her tag, a sprawling letter M, blitzed with stars and topped with a crown cocked boldly to the side. She stood there for a while, her ink wet on the walls, her eyes stinging with heat as the salesgirl sighed again, impatiently on the other side of the door. "You good, ma'am?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay." She breathed in and tugged at the denim again. If the jeans would not give, she wished they would take and take until her body really became a separate thing from her smile, something she could leave there on the fitting room floor while she floated above the clothes, above the noise, above the expectant whine of the salesgirl, away. She tried again 6 times until she couldn't take the pain around her middle anymore. Then she breathed in and let the denim fall, wishing she could suck up her skin, her fat, her muscle, and whatever it was that lay underneath those things, making her who she was, this person in this body, wedged between the 2 tight walls of the big and tall men's section, wishing more than anything to feel small and slight and somehow like a girl. Thank you. So I guess we can have a conversation, right? And do questions.
Would you like me to put
I don't know. What shall we do?
Would you like to do it yourself?
I can do it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we're open for questions.
We have a mic coming around for you guys.
There's
to
even a
use.
microphone. So
Thank you so much for that reading.
thank you, Jessica.
I'm really glad you read the second section that brought in music
Yeah.
so directly. It felt I read the book and it felt like such an important thread, important identity marker,
Yeah.
a way of growing. I'd love to hear about how the music happened for you. Was it you knew what songs you were going to use and what artists,
Right.
or did the character tell you? How did that go?
That's a great question. So I first will just share it. So there's a Big Girl playlist, and it was playing. That was what was playing while we were listening to while we were kind of preparing for the reading. I wasn't planning to read that section, but when I heard that the playlist was on, I was like, okay, music is already, and I said this to somebody, music is already in the building, right? And hip hop specifically is already in the building. So it felt right to read that section. And in some ways, that's how my relationship with music as a writer, I think, really sort of works, right? It's always there for me. And it really is only in the process of not even writing this novel, but talking about this novel, that I've come to fully or more fully understand the extent to which music, it works as a literary influence for me and always has. So, I think of my literary influences as primarily Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, Audre Lorde, and Jamaica Kincaid. But the truth of the matter is that as far as sort of dexterity with language and metaphor, storytelling, right, hip hop in general has been as formative for me, especially as a teenager listening to 90s hip hop, right, where storytelling and sort of wordplay were such crucial elements of the form. So that's the kind of general music I think has always been part of my writing. For Malaya, though, hip hop represents selfhood, right, identity, a connection with Harlem, because again, much of her life takes place elsewhere, right? And so music is it's something that connects her to the life of the neighborhood around her. And specifically Biggie. Biggie is a major figure here, right? Because, he represents a kind of freedom, an emotional complexity, again, a kind of expressivity, right, through language, all experienced sort of while inhabiting a big Black body. And a big Black body that has a complex relationship to gender and to desire. So he's, the epitome of a problematic fave for Malaya and for me. And yet, what he does, the specter of him, right, what that does for her is something that she needs at this stage in her life. And too, as I was kind of saying a little bit before I read that second section, hip hop, especially 90s hip hop, right, the kind of the era of the remix, the era of the hook and verse, it really did, and the era of the sample, right, it ends up sort of having this interesting function of connecting generations, right? So that like there's a moment where Percy is sort of listening to Malaya playing Juicy, and he expects it to be Mtume's Juicy Fruit, right? Because that's where the sample comes from. So it's an interesting way of connecting generations, while also, right, sort of being this province of Black youth culture that Malaya finds really gratifying and necessary in her life. It's a source of pleasure at the end of the day for her, as it is for me. Thank you for that. And the Big Girl playlist is on Spotify. I had QR cards and I totally forgot to bring them, but you can definitely listen to it. It's pretty good if I do say so myself. Yes,
I know you're spending most of your time traveling these days and teaching and doing everything else that you do.
Right.
But I'm wondering, have you had time to begin to think about what you want to write next, and are you starting on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. I am still sort of gathering the language to talk about what I think is next. I've got two ideas, and I'm trying to figure out whether they are a single project. I think they might be a single project, but I'm thinking a lot about translations of Black feminist literature into French and Spanish specifically, and there are a couple of sort of texts that I'm thinking about, but I'm not going to talk about that yet. But, sort of Black feminist literature of the 70s and 80s that's translated into French and Spanish in the sort of late 1990s into the aughts, I guess is what we call them, right, the early 2000s. And so because I've been traveling a lot, for dissertation research and that kind of thing, I've been noticing some of the ways in which those translations sort of impact Black, queer, and feminist community in a way that I know that I want to explore in writing. And the question is sort of what the genre is going to be. And I think I have an idea, but I was fortunate enough I spent October at the Malay Arts residency. And so that was, it's just it's a gift, right, to really sort of spend a month in the woods, which I was nervous about, but, I'm here, so I survived. And really sort of immerse myself in these ideas and begin to sort of, think about what that will turn into. But I'm excited about it. And I guess the other sort of thread there is, as I said, mobility is an important part of the novel, both in terms of Malaya's movement, her sort of relationship with her body, how she moves in her body, how she moves her body, how her body moves her in certain ways, and then also her access to the world and to space. And so she's constantly sort of thinking about language, about travel, what travel might look like. And so there's what I'm imagining working on next sort of picks up that thread. It's a totally different sort of, again, genre and different set of personae, if you will. But that question of non-normative embodiments and transnational mobility is something that I'm definitely thinking about a lot. So thank you for that. Yeah. Yes, I think so. I don't. Yes, please.
Excuse me.
Oh, thank you. One thing I just want to say is when you read the description of 125th Street, just before it was cleared out and everybody moved over to 116th to the 10th, was so evocative. I mean, it was so beautifully rendered. You know, I lived in New York at the time, and I could just it was beautifully rendered. That part. So I just wanted to ask you. It seems as though the maternal figures, women, are the ones who are enforcing a certain idea about femininity and size, appropriateness, how one occupies space. It's a trope I kind of associate with Caribbean literature. But I wonder if, and then, you know, this figure of another way to inhabit a body is Biggie. And could you talk a little bit about those dynamics? I'm going to read the novel, so don't tell me too much detail, but just in general, your thoughts.
Okay, this is good, because I'm glad you said that, because I was about to give a spoiler right away. But yes, okay, so absolutely, right, the relationships between and among women in this novel and women in Malaya's family are a central part of the novel. You know, she's constantly curious, and the first section that I read is from a chapter titled Ladiness, and this is when we really start to see her understand femininity as something to explore, right? Sort of as, you know, as something that's available for interpretation and analysis and discovery and learning. And so, of course, as any child would, right, sort of the first place she goes to learn about whatever this thing is her mother and eventually her grandmother. But she's kind of looking everywhere to figure out what womanhood or what femininity might be, and again, sort of what kinds of access she might have to it, given her body that falls outside the bounds of what girlhood is supposed to look like. And then, you know, to figure out sort of whether that's something she wants, right? Does she want to accomplish or achieve ladiness or not? The legacy, I think of it as a kind of inherited legacy, right? And for Malaya to figure out, she knows right away that her mother's expectations of her and her body don't feel good. She starts to notice that they probably don't seem to feel good to her mother as well, right? As she notices the gold dress and the constant frustration with the body that she watches her mother experience. It's not until she starts to really sort of think carefully and, you know, with great curiosity about her grandmother that she comes to see how her mother has come to be the way she is, both for herself and in relationship to Malaya. So, you know, for me, that is in some ways, that's a major sort of catalyst. You know, it animates the kind of inner arc of Malaya's growth and her living, right? She's trying to figure out what womanhood is, whether it has a place for her, and how it comes to be. And so that sort of drives her to understand her mother differently. And in order to do that, she has to understand her grandmother differently. Your point about Caribbean literature is really interesting. I mean, you know, Jamaica Kincaid is a major influence, right? And like, first of all, this is quite a moment because, in fact, the last time I got to see Jamaica Kincaid read was actually here, you know, many years ago. And it was a beautiful reading and really interesting. And someone asked her about, you know, mother-daughter relationships. And of course, what she always says, and what many scholars and critics have said of her work, is that, you know, in many ways, the mother-daughter relationship echoes various oppressive power dynamics, essentially, right, including colonial relationships. And many scholars have written about how the mother sort of stands in as a colonizer. For me, you know, it makes sense that, you know, a woman who has become so accomplished in, you know, sort of achieving or at least pursuing successful femininity, of course she's going to pass that down to her child, you know, as a protection, as an armor, right? A very sort of thorny, painful, violent, damaging armor. And of course, if it goes unquestioned, that will be passed down to the grandchildren and the next generations. And so part of what Malaya wants to figure out is a way out of that legacy, right, for herself, and for others. So that's a spoiler-free version. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for reading. I was like, I always think like when people read their like stuff out loud, it's like different than when I think in my head. So like you kind of read it almost with like a musical like quality. It was like very smooth. But I was like wondering like within the like these two chapters or just like different chapters of the book, was like the writing process like different for each, or was like one harder, or?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for your comment about, sort of hearing the work differently in my voice. I have that experience too, which is why I like going to readings, I feel like I always get something new. And when I read my own work, I sort of hear something new. And so there's a kind of process point that I'll just sort of make briefly, which is that when we got to edit with my fantastic editor, Gina Iaquinta, who I feel like I have to shout out every single time, I talk about this process, because it was a beautiful, beautiful editorial process. And one of the things I did was sit down a few times and just read the book out loud to myself, start to finish, like basically without stopping. I stopped to sleep, eat a meal here and there, bust out a little workout, but it was truly what I was doing with, those weekends. And that definitely helped kind of unearth, sort of nuances and textures of the novel that made it better, I think, honestly. What was the other part? What was your actual question? I feel like I lost it, I forgot it.
Oh, like, was the writing process
Yes,
like,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so was it different from chapter to chapter? 100%, for many reasons, including, so the very first draft of this novel was my master's thesis at Temple University, right? Long time ago. Before I had even set foot on Penn's campus, I was working on this story. It was a very different draft. It was much, much longer. It shifted point of view, and it was longer partly because of the point of view shifts, and also partly because it sort of explored time worked differently, and so it sort of covered, in some ways, more years in the character's life. So then I was like, okay, well, I need to keep working on this novel. I love teaching. I was taking literature courses with PhD students in English at Temple, and I was like, I like this. Literary theory is cool. Like, I hadn't really had my major as an undergrad was Afro-American studies, and so I was doing a lot of theory, not just literary theory though, but this was my first time doing kind of like deep dive into literary theory. I was like, this is great. I'll just get this PhD, and while I'm working on this PhD, I'm gonna finish my novel. And like, it was obvious that of course this is what's gonna happen. And turned out that that's not the way PhD programs work. And that's also not the way time worked, apparently. So for that reason, there would be long stretches of time between drafts, between chapters, between sections even, where I would, have to put it down and teach and, take my exams and, but I kept coming back to it. So because of that process, because there were these long stretches of time between chapters, yeah, absolutely, my approach kind of worked differently, right? So, times, for example, the first chapter, I'll never forget when I drafted it. I was right at Temple's Center City campus, right across the street from City Hall. And I woke up one morning, I was like, okay, I had an idea. And I was like, all right, I'm just gonna go to the computer lab, because that was a thing back in the day. I'm just gonna write this. And it came out almost whole. It's been revised, but honestly, the first chapter really has been more or less what it is from the beginning. That was the easiest process. I think that's often the case for first chapters or first sections. But then as time went on, every chapter, every section, it really, my process and my way of approaching it really depended on how much time I had, what kind of time I had, right? Sort of like if I have a whole month, then I can really luxuriate. If not, I might have to sort of come back several times over the course of more than a month, right? So that, in some ways, that's what really shaped my approach to each chapter. But I will say by the end, honestly, the COVID lockdown, right, was the time where suddenly I was fortunate enough to have a home, to be healthy, to have space, and to have time. And suddenly I was able to really sort of give each section the attention that I felt like it needed and deserved. And so that sort of evened things out a little bit. Thank you for that question. I think he's coming.
We have a question on the YouTube.
Okay.
Erika Jacobs says, wish I could have made it to the reading. What made you want to write this novel beginning from the perspective of girlhood?
Well, thank you for that question. So, I mentioned my kind of like literary pantheon, right? Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, Jamaica Kincaid, Audre Lorde. I discovered those writers when I was very young. I was not that much older than Malaya, actually, at that time. I was about 11 years old when I read The Bluest Eye. And Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow's Enough. My grandmother had a copy of Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And, she lived not far from here, in fact, in Philly. And I remember sort of, rifling through her library, through my mother's library in our home. And I discovered all of these works about Black girlhood. And, I was too young to be reading these books, right? But I had a fantastic English teacher, shout out to Amy Cassell, who, sort of invited us to talk about what we were reading and, and to just sort of like view literature as something that was for us, right? Even when these particular texts weren't actually quote unquote for me. So when I realized that Black girlhood could be the subject of literature, and also at that same time realized that writing about Black girlhood or other themes and concerns that were of interest to me, that could be a way to spend a life, I was done. I was done for. It was it. Like that was what I was going to do. And I was pretty clear about that from a very young age. So there's that, right? I kind of always knew that I wanted to write about the experiences of Black girls and women. And I expand that to think about Black queer people, Black gender expansive people, basically thinking about sort of how gender, desire, embodiment, and Blackness sort of function in various spaces and contexts. I also, too, when you think about I don't want to say coming of age narratives because they're not all coming of age narratives, but fictional accounts or explorations of Black girlhood often think a lot about the body, but I hadn't found a story that spoke to this particular dynamic of Black girl embodiment as a kind of central theme. And again, this was, the mid to late, well, I guess we're sort of getting into the 90s at this point, right? So that was something that I knew I just really wanted to evoke, especially in thinking about, again, class and mobility. One of the things that I didn't talk about the novel is that what's happening with class mobility is complex because Malaya's father has grown up in the projects, poor and literally hungry. And so, hungry in a physical, bodily way. And so for him, we talked about how it's the women that are sort of enforcing, or policing the body in particular ways. Her father kind of goes in the opposite direction because he wants to make sure that she's not hungry. He wants to avoid that sense of a kind of crushing lack that he's experienced. And that the dynamic of sort of various kinds of hunger, how they come to play on this character's body was something that I knew I wanted to explore. And it was something I knew I wanted to contribute to this ongoing conversation about Black girlhood in fiction. I think there was a question here too.
Thank you. So before the reading, you had mentioned rhythm, and I was wondering, how do you think about sound, like formally or textually? Throughout the novel, I was especially taken not only with descriptions of music, but also with the sounds of food, which I thought was very interesting.
Wow, I love that. I have to say, the sounds of food. I mean, yeah. Wow, that's a great question. Well, as a writer, I tend to pay a lot of attention to the sensory and the sensual. I mean, that's not, every writer does this, right? But it's an entry point into other elements or realms of fiction for me. So to understand character, I often start with sort of how the character feels physically in their body as they're moving through space. To understand setting, I'm absolutely thinking about sound. I think it's probably safe to say that in general, the sounds of a place come to me before the sights of a place. And so, you know, that I think is, you see that, I imagine, happening in the novel too. The sounds of food, I mean, that's really interesting. It takes me two places. First of all, I think about, again, sort of, I tend to root, especially with this novel, I tend to root my exploration of the story in the body. And so, you know, when you, among food's many delights, right, there is a sonic delight, what it sounds like to gulp, right, to swish, to lick, to taste, to swallow, right? All of those things are sort of sensory pleasures that somebody like Malaya is absolutely attentive to, right? She enjoys food, especially when she's at her healthiest emotionally. She enjoys food, right? It's something that she wants to spend time sort of thinking about. But I also go right to this moment in the work of Audre Lorde, where she says, I realized if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into others' fantasies for me and eaten alive. And that the crunching has always sort of stood out to me as a sound of food, right? Like there's a kind of onomatopoeia going on there. But in that language, she wants us to think about the sounds of consumption, right? And to think about, you know, how those sounds of consumption have a kind of political valence, right? What does it mean to consume? What does it mean to be consumed? The bringing crunching into it, right? As opposed to, for example, crushing, which might have been, and often it's misquoted as crushing because it makes sense. But Lorde is deliberate about wanting us to know, to think about what's happening with the body, how sound gets us to the kind of uncomfortable, maybe painful, maybe pleasurable sort of realms of the body. And that's definitely something that I try to do in my work as well. So thank you for that. I'm going to keep thinking about that.
Hi.
Hi.
What was it like writing in third person, especially about a character who's dealing with other people's perceptions and expectations of her?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the point of view has kind of changed. It, you know, it's always been third person. And, you know, so this is really interesting, right? Third person, of course, the kind of, you know, she, they, you know, as opposed to an I or a you. This novel just sort of, I mean, the sort of craft answer and the process answer is that voice tends to be one of the first things that comes to me, and the voice of this narrator came to me pretty clearly as a third person voice. I did have a brilliant and wonderful creative writing teacher who was like, this should be a first person story, at least try it. And I tried it and it just didn't work. It took a while for me to figure out why it wasn't working, and I think it has to do with the fact that I needed my narrator to have access to some language that Malaya doesn't have, especially as she's much younger. And it's not just language. I needed my narrator to have access, brief, sort of fleeting access to a worldview that Malaya doesn't have at that age. So, for example, there was a moment that I registered even in the section that I just read, but there are these moments where the point of view sort of briefly touches on a kind of omniscience. There's a moment in the first chapter, for example, where she's trying to, you know, she's at a Weight Watchers meeting and they're like, what's your trigger food that, you know, that sort of makes you, whatever, lose control of your diet? And so all of these people are putting, you know, foods on this board, foods that, you know, pie and, you know, grits and whatever. And she's like, well, I don't know. I haven't yet learned the words like abundance, profusion, glut. The only word that she has to describe her trigger is more, right? I needed the narrator to kind of supply missing language for Malaya from time to time. And again, it's not just about language, a worldview, a perspective that as an 8-year-old or a 15-year-old that she doesn't have. Of course, there are ways to do that in the first person, but for me, the third person, you know, was the way to do that. And, you know, I mean, I do think there's an element there too of, you know, I think there's a way that the third person can sort of, the first person does this too, but the third person is really good, especially a more or less limited third person, I find to be really helpful for tapping into the, you know, the broader, the kind of the connection between the specific and the universal, right? The kind of the deep sort of very, you know, sort of human, sometimes maybe even peculiar, idiosyncratic nuance of a character as it might connect to, you know, any range of human beings. And I find that that's something that the third person can do. You're sort of inviting yourself to think who this general, you know, she is, right? And maybe you might find yourself in elements of her experience. and not find yourself in others, but you're invited to think about your relationship to the character in the third person in a way that I found to be really important for this story. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah, in my fiction, I'm usually drawn to first person, so it's an important question. It's something I've thought about a lot for this book.
Mecca, I want to thank you and thank the audience for the reading and being so generous with our questions. I invite the audience, please, to pass them to the other room. There are books for sale and refreshments. And you'll sign
Yes,
the
I'll
book.
definitely sign.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right, thank you again.
We all went to high school together. And it was definitely 1999.